The Silk Road was not a single road, and it was never just about silk. It was a vast and evolving network of land and sea routes that connected East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe for nearly 2,000 years. It carried goods, yes, but also religions, technologies, languages, diseases, empires, and ideas that reshaped the course of world history. To understand the Silk Road, you must first abandon the idea of a fixed highway stretching from China to Rome. Instead, imagine a living web of trade corridors, caravan routes, oasis cities, mountain passes, and maritime sea lanes, constantly shifting with the rise and fall of empires. Merchants rarely traveled the entire distance. Instead, goods changed hands multiple times, moving step by step across continents. The origins of this vast network go far deeper than the famous Han Dynasty expansion. Long before the term Silk Road was ever invented in the 19th century, Eurasian societies were already connected through fragmented but active exchange systems. Archaeological evidence suggests that as early as the second millennium BCE, luxury materials such as jade from Central Asia were being transported into ancient China. In the opposite direction, early Chinese goods, such as lacquerware and silk-like textiles, began appearing far west of their place of origin. These exchanges were not yet part of a unified system, but they formed the foundations of later global connectivity. At the heart of early Eurasian trade were geography and necessity. The Eurasian landmass is divided into distinct ecological zones: the dense agricultural civilizations of China in the east, the vast steppe grasslands of Central Asia, the desert corridors of the Tarim Basin, the Iranian Plateau, and the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia leading into the Mediterranean world. Each of these regions produced different goods, skills, and cultures. Trade emerged naturally as a way of balancing these differences. Nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe played a crucial role in this early system. Unlike sedentary agricultural societies, nomads could move rapidly across vast distances, guiding caravans and connecting distant regions. They were not simply intermediaries, but active participants in shaping trade routes, controlling access to key passes, and negotiating between empires. Their mobility made them indispensable in the development of long-distance exchange. By the early first millennium BCE, trade routes had already begun to form recognizable corridors. One of the most important was the so-called steppe route, stretching across the northern grasslands from Mongolia to Eastern Europe. Another followed the oasis towns of the Tarim Basin, where small but wealthy city-states such as Khotan and Kashgar emerged as essential stopping points for caravans crossing the Taklamakan Desert. These routes were dangerous, unpredictable, and heavily dependent on local knowledge, yet they were already facilitating the movement of goods across thousands of kilometers. At this stage, trade was still largely regional, but the foundations of long-distance exchange were firmly in place. What changed everything was the rise of powerful centralized empires in both East and West Eurasia. These empires did not create the Silk Road, but they stabilized and expanded it. In China, the unification under the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE and the subsequent consolidation under the Han dynasty marked a turning point in Eurasian connectivity. The Han state, driven by both economic ambition and military necessity, began to actively expand westward. One of the most important figures in this expansion was the envoy Zhang Qian, who was sent on diplomatic missions into Central Asia in the 2nd century BCE. His journeys revealed the existence of sophisticated civilizations beyond China's western frontier, including the kingdoms of the Fergana Valley and the powerful Yuezhi and Sogdian cultures. These discoveries fundamentally changed Chinese foreign policy, opening the way for sustained contact with the West. This period is often described as the opening of the Silk Road, though in reality it was more of a formalization of pre-existing routes rather than a sudden creation. The Han dynasty established military garrisons, trading posts, and protective infrastructure along key corridors, particularly around the Hexi Corridor in modern-day Gansu province. This allowed caravans to travel with greater security, reducing risk and increasing trade volume. At the same time, in the West, the Roman Republic was transforming into the Roman Empire. Rome's expansion across the Mediterranean world created an enormous demand for luxury goods from the East, particularly silk, spices, precious stones, and fine textiles. Silk became especially prized among Roman elites, not only as a material, but as a symbol of status and wealth. Roman writers often described silk as a mysterious substance produced in distant lands by silkworms, reflecting how little direct knowledge existed between the two ends of Eurasia. Between China and Rome lay a chain of intermediary powers that were just as important as the two great empires themselves. The Parthian Empire in Persia controlled key sections of the overland route, acting as both gatekeepers and middlemen. The Kushan Empire in northern India connected the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia and facilitated the transmission of Buddhism along the trade routes. These intermediary civilizations were not passive conduits. They shaped the flow of goods, taxed trade, and influenced cultural exchange. What emerged by the first centuries BCE and CE was not a single road, but a structured system of exchange zones. Goods such as silk, glassware, spices, horses, precious metals, and textiles moved across multiple legs of a journey, changing hands repeatedly. A silk robe produced in China might pass through Sogdian merchants in Central Asia, reach Parthian markets in Persia, and eventually be sold in Roman Egypt or the city of Antioch. At no point did a single merchant necessarily carry it the entire distance. Alongside goods, ideas began to move with increasing intensity. Buddhism traveled from India into Central Asia and eventually into China, profoundly reshaping East Asian spiritual traditions. Nestorian Christianity spread eastward from the Near East into Persia and beyond. Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and later Islam all found pathways along these same routes. Artistic styles blended, languages influenced one another, and scientific knowledge, including mathematics and astronomy, traveled across cultural boundaries. The Silk Road was therefore never just an economic system. It was a mechanism of cultural fusion, constantly reshaping the civilizations it connected. But this connectivity came at a cost. Disease also traveled along the trade routes. The most infamous example is the spread of plague during the late Roman Empire, which may have contributed to major demographic and political crises. In this sense, the Silk Road functioned as both a bridge and a vulnerability, linking societies not only in prosperity but also in shared risk. As the classical period progressed, the Silk Road reached its first major peak under the stability of the Han Dynasty in the east and the Roman Empire in the west. Yet even at this stage, it remained fragile. The system depended heavily on political stability, secure trade corridors, and cooperation between multiple empires. When these conditions collapsed, so too did sections of the network. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, both Rome and Han China faced internal instability and external pressure. Trade routes became more dangerous, and long-distance exchange declined in certain regions. However, the Silk Road did not disappear. Instead, it adapted, shifting toward new power centers and evolving into different configurations that would later be revitalized under the Sasanian Empire and most dramatically under the Mongol Empire centuries later. This early history reveals a fundamental truth. The Silk Road was never a single invention, nor the product of one civilization. It was the result of centuries of gradual integration, shaped by geography, empire, commerce, and human curiosity. And it was only the beginning. The expansion of the Silk Road into what historians often call its classical phase began when Eurasia's great early empires reached their first sustained moments of overlap. This was not a moment of sudden discovery, but rather a gradual intensification of contact that turned fragmented regional trade into something far more structured and far-reaching. By the 2nd century BCE, the Han Dynasty in China had begun pushing its influence westward with increasing determination. This was not driven by commerce alone. It was also driven by security. The northern frontier of China was under constant pressure from powerful nomadic confederations, particularly the Xiongnu. These steppe groups controlled vast territories stretching across Mongolia and Central Asia, and their mobility made them difficult to confront through conventional warfare. In response, the Han court developed a dual strategy: military defense combined with diplomatic expansion. The most famous figure associated with this strategy was Zhang Qian, a court envoy sent westward in the 130s BCE. His mission was to seek alliances against the Xiongnu, but what he discovered instead was a complex world of Central Asian kingdoms, sophisticated trade networks, and powerful nomadic and sedentary cultures that had long existed beyond China's direct knowledge. When Zhang Qian returned, after years of captivity and travel, he brought back reports that transformed Chinese understanding of the wider world. He described the Fergana Valley, known for its heavenly horses, which the Han court desperately sought for military advantage. He also reported on the Yuezhi, a displaced nomadic people who had migrated far west and established influence in Bactria. These accounts did more than inform policy. They reshaped the geographical imagination of China itself. From this point onward, the Han Dynasty began actively investing in Western expansion. Military garrisons were established along the Hexi Corridor, a narrow but vital passage between the Chinese heartland and the deserts of Central Asia. This corridor became one of the most important arteries of the Silk Road, linking China to the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin. These oasis cities were essential. Places like Dunhuang, Kucha, Cotton, and Kashgar functioned as lifelines for caravans crossing the harsh Taklamakan Desert. Without them, long-distance travel would have been nearly impossible. Each city served as a rest point, a trading hub, and a cultural meeting place where languages, religions, and goods intermingled. At the same time, in the West, the Roman world was expanding its own economic and cultural reach. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had transitioned from republic to empire under Augustus. The stability of the Pax Romana created unprecedented conditions for long-distance trade across the Mediterranean. Roman demand for Eastern luxury goods grew rapidly, especially for silk, spices, perfumes, gemstones, and fine textiles. However, Rome and China never directly established diplomatic contact during this period. Instead, their connection was indirect, mediated through a chain of intermediary powers that controlled different segments of the Silk Road. This is one of the most important features of the classical Silk Road system. It was multi-centered, not bilateral. Between East and West lay the Parthian Empire, which controlled much of Iran and Mesopotamia. The Parthians were masters of intermediary trade. They understood the value of controlling access points between civilizations and profited enormously from taxing and facilitating commerce. Roman writers often complained about Parthian control of Eastern trade routes, not fully understanding that without such intermediaries, the system itself would not function. Further east, the Kushan Empire emerged as a critical bridge between India, Central Asia, and China. The Kushans controlled key sections of the northern Indian subcontinent and extended their influence into the Tarim Basin. Under rulers such as Kanishka the Great, the Kushan Empire became a major patron of Buddhism, helping to transform it from a regional Indian religion into a transcontinental spiritual tradition. This transformation is one of the most significant cultural consequences of the Silk Road. As merchants traveled along the trade routes, they carried not only goods, but also ideas. Buddhist monks began accompanying caravans, using the same infrastructure that supported commerce to spread teachings across Central Asia. Monasteries were established in oasis towns, often serving both as religious centers and as safe havens for travelers. Art from this period reveals the depth of cultural blending. In regions such as Gandhara, in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, Buddhist imagery began to incorporate Greco-Roman artistic influences. The depiction of the Buddha in human form, with draped robes resembling classical Greek sculpture, is one of the most striking examples of cultural fusion in ancient history. This style emerged directly from the interaction between Hellenistic traditions left by Alexander the Great's earlier conquests and the Buddhist traditions of India. Meanwhile, Central Asia itself became dominated by the Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking merchant people who played an essential role in Silk Road commerce. The Sogdians were among the most influential traders of the ancient world. They established colonies across Central Asia, China, and beyond, acting as linguistic and commercial intermediaries. Their language became a lingua franca of trade across much of the Silk Road network. Sogdian merchants were not simply passive traders. They were cultural transmitters. They carried religious ideas such as Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and later Manichaeism across vast distances. They also influenced art, music, and even court culture in China, where Sogdian performers and merchants became a familiar presence in major cities like Chang'an, the Han capital. Chang'an itself became one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. Located at the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, it was a cosmopolitan metropolis filled with foreign merchants, diplomats, religious figures, and artisans. Goods arriving from Central Asia, India, Persia, and beyond were exchanged in its bustling markets. The city was not only a political capital, but also a global crossroads. One of the most important developments of this era was the increasing sophistication of trade logistics. Caravan systems became highly organized, often relying on networks of guides, translators, and local intermediaries. Camels, especially the Bactrian camel, with its ability to withstand harsh desert conditions, became the backbone of overland trade. These animals transformed the feasibility of long-distance travel across Central Asia's deserts and steppes. At the same time, maritime routes began to develop more extensively. While the Overland Silk Road is more famous, sea routes connecting China, Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa were already becoming increasingly important. These maritime silk roads allowed for larger cargo volumes and more stable seasonal travel, complementing the overland network. Despite this growing connectivity, the Silk Road remained highly vulnerable to political instability. When empires weakened or collapsed, trade routes often became dangerous or temporarily unusable. The fall of the Western Han dynasty in the early 3rd century CE, for example, led to a temporary decline in Chinese control over Central Asian corridors. Similarly, internal crises within the Roman Empire disrupted Mediterranean demand and trade stability. Yet even during periods of fragmentation, the Silk Road did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. New powers emerged to fill gaps left by collapsing empires. Trade continued through decentralized networks, often controlled by local rulers, nomadic confederations, or merchant guilds. One of the most important transitions occurred during the rise of the Sasanian Empire in Persia in the 3rd century CE. The Sasanians replaced the Parthians and reasserted strong centralized control over key western segments of the Silk Road. They became major competitors of the Roman Empire, not only militarily, but also economically, controlling critical trade arteries and influencing the flow of luxury goods into the Mediterranean world. At the same time, in China, the collapse of Han authority led to the period of disunity known as the Three Kingdoms and later the Northern and Southern dynasties. During this fragmented era, foreign influence increased significantly within China itself. Buddhist communities expanded rapidly, supported by both foreign monks and local converts. The Silk Road became not just a trade network, but also a channel of profound religious transformation. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Buddhism had firmly established itself within Chinese society. Monasteries, translation centers, and pilgrimage routes spread across northern and western China. The transmission of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit and Central Asian languages into Chinese became one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the ancient world. Meanwhile, the western end of the Silk Road was undergoing its own transformation. The weakening of Roman authority and the increasing instability of late antiquity shifted trade dynamics across the Mediterranean and Near East. While long-distance trade continued, it became more fragmented and regionally controlled. Despite these changes, the Silk Road remained active. It had become too deeply embedded in the structures of Eurasian civilization to disappear. Instead, it entered a new phase, one defined by decentralization, adaptation, and increasing cultural synthesis. By the end of the classical period, the Silk Road had already achieved something unprecedented in human history. It had created a continuous, if fragmented, system of exchange stretching across nearly the entire inhabited Eurasian world. No single empire controlled it. No single culture defined it. It was a shared space of interaction, shaped by countless actors across centuries. And it was about to enter its most transformative era yet. As the classical world fragmented and reshaped itself after the fall of earlier imperial unities, the Silk Road did not collapse. Instead, it shifted into a new phase defined less by two great anchor empires and more by a dense mosaic of regional powers. This post-classical era, spanning roughly from the 6th to the 13th centuries, is when the Silk Road became more diverse, more religiously transformative, and in many ways more globally influential than ever before. In China, a new imperial revival emerged under the sway and then the Tang dynasty. The Tang period, beginning in 618 CE, is often considered one of the greatest golden ages in Chinese history, and it coincided with one of the most vibrant phases of Silk Road activity. The Tang capital, Chang'an, became an even more cosmopolitan hub than it had been under earlier dynasties. Foreign merchants, diplomats, monks, and entertainers were not just tolerated, but actively integrated into urban life. The city functioned as a global metropolis centuries before the modern concept of globalization existed. Under the Tang, the Silk Road reached a level of institutional support that had not been seen before. The state maintained frontier garrisons, protected key trade corridors, and engaged in diplomacy with Central Asian kingdoms. The empire's influence extended deep into the Tarim Basin and at times even into parts of modern-day Afghanistan and Kazakhstan. This allowed relatively stable conditions for overland trade across Central Asia, though stability was always fragile and dependent on shifting political alliances. At the same time, the Islamic world was undergoing one of the most rapid expansions in human history. Following the rise of Islam in the 7th century and the establishment of the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, a vast new political and economic system emerged stretching from Spain and North Africa through the Middle East and into Central Asia. This created a powerful new intermediary zone that connected the Silk Road's western and central segments. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 750 CE, the Islamic world entered what is often called its Golden Age. Baghdad became a center of learning, trade, and cultural synthesis. The city sat at a crucial crossroads between East and West, linking Mediterranean trade networks with Central Asian and Indian Ocean routes. Scholars in Baghdad translated scientific and philosophical works from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese traditions, preserving and expanding knowledge that would later influence both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. The Abbasids did not simply inherit Silk Road trade, they actively reshaped it. Muslim merchants became dominant figures in long-distance commerce, particularly in maritime trade across the Indian Ocean. While overland routes remained important, sea routes grew increasingly central. Ships could carry far larger quantities of goods than caravans, and maritime navigation along monsoon wind patterns allowed relatively predictable seasonal travel between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. This maritime Silk Road became just as important as the overland network. Ports such as Basra, Aden, Calicut, and Guangzhou became key nodes in a vast oceanic trading system. Goods such as spices, textiles, porcelain, glassware, precious metals, and aromatics circulated through these ports, linking economies across Afro-Eurasia in increasingly complex ways. In China, the Tang dynasty also became deeply involved in maritime trade. Guangzhou, in particular, emerged as a major international port city where Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants conducted business. Chinese porcelain and silk became highly sought-after commodities across the Islamic world and beyond, while Chinese merchants imported spices, precious stones, and new agricultural products. This period also saw the continued spread and transformation of major world religions along Silk Road routes. Buddhism reached its cultural peak in East Asia during the Tang era, producing some of the most sophisticated philosophical schools in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese history. Monasteries became powerful economic and intellectual institutions, often deeply integrated into trade networks. At the same time, Islam spread eastward into Central Asia, where it gradually replaced earlier religions such as Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and various local traditions. This process was not immediate or uniform. In many regions, religious traditions coexisted for centuries, blending and influencing one another before Islam eventually became dominant. One of the most important intermediary groups during this time was still the Sogdians, though their influence began to decline after the 8th century. The Sogdians had long served as the commercial and cultural bridge between China and the Islamic world. However, as Islamic merchants increasingly dominated trade routes and as Chinese political structures shifted, Sogdian autonomy and influence gradually diminished. Many Sogdians were absorbed into broader Islamic or Chinese societies, though their legacy remained deeply embedded in Silk Road culture. Another transformative force of this period was technological exchange. One of the most significant examples is the transmission of papermaking technology. Originating in China during the Han Dynasty, papermaking spread westward along Silk Road routes, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century after encounters such as the Battle of Talas in 751 CE between the Abbasids and Tang forces. From the Islamic world, papermaking eventually spread into Europe, where it revolutionized administration, education, and communication. Similarly, innovations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering circulated across Silk Road networks. Indian numerals, for example, were transmitted through Islamic scholars into Europe, eventually forming the basis of the numerical system used globally today. This intellectual exchange was as important as the movement of physical goods, shaping the development of science and technology across continents. Despite its vibrancy, the Silk Road remained vulnerable to political disruption. The Tang dynasty itself faced severe crises in the mid-8th century, most notably the Lushan Rebellion beginning in 755 CE. This massive internal conflict weakened imperial control, disrupted trade routes, and contributed to a gradual decline in Tang power. While trade did not stop, it became less centralized and more regionally fragmented. Similarly, the Abbasid Caliphate experienced political fragmentation over time, with regional dynasties gaining increasing autonomy. Yet even as central authority weakened, trade networks continued to function through merchant communities, local rulers, and established commercial traditions. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Silk Road had become a deeply embedded system that no single empire fully controlled. Instead, it functioned as a multi-layered network of overlapping political spheres, economic interests, and cultural zones. Trade was driven as much by private merchants and local communities as by imperial policy. One of the most significant developments in this later post-classical period was the increasing importance of the Mongol steppe world, which would soon reshape the entire structure of Eurasian exchange. But even before the rise of the Mongol Empire, steppe confederations, such as the Turkic Khaganates, had already played a major role in controlling and facilitating Silk Road routes. The Turks acted as intermediaries across Central Asia, often bridging Chinese, Persian, and Islamic spheres of influence. At the same time, Europe was gradually becoming more connected to Silk Road networks through indirect channels. While medieval Europe was less central to overland trade than China or the Islamic world, luxury goods, especially spices and silk, still reached European markets through intermediaries in the Islamic Mediterranean world and later through Italian trading cities such as Venice and Genoa. By the end of the post-classical period, the Silk Road had evolved into something far more complex than its earlier forms. It was no longer dominated by a few imperial powers, nor limited to overland caravans alone. It had become a fully transcontinental system integrating land and sea routes, multiple religions, diverse political entities, and increasingly sophisticated commercial networks. Yet even this expanded system was about to undergo a transformation so dramatic that it would temporarily unify much of Eurasia under a single political structure, reshaping trade, culture, and connectivity on an unprecedented scale. The world of the Mongols was approaching, and with it, the greatest expansion of the Silk Road in history. By the early 13th century, the Silk Road entered its most intensely connected and globally integrated phase. This transformation was driven not by gradual evolution alone, but by the sudden rise of one of the largest contiguous empires in human history, the Mongol Empire. Before the Mongols, Eurasia had always been connected, but it was fragmented. Trade depended on negotiation between multiple empires, kingdoms, and intermediaries. Routes shifted constantly depending on war, taxation, and political instability. What the Mongols changed was not the existence of the Silk Road, but its level of safety, speed, and administrative unity. The rise of the Mongol Empire began under Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan. Born into a fractured steppe world, he united the Mongol tribes through a combination of military strategy, political alliances, and ruthless conquest. By 1206, he had been proclaimed the supreme ruler of the Mongols, and from that moment, expansion accelerated dramatically. The Mongol military campaigns spread across Central Asia, China, Persia, and eventually Eastern Europe. Within a few decades, the empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe, forming a continuous landmass under Mongol control. This vast empire was not centrally governed in a modern sense, but it was unified under a shared system of law, military organization, and imperial communication. This period is often called the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, not because warfare disappeared, but because large parts of Eurasia experienced unprecedented stability along trade routes. For merchants, this was revolutionary. Caravan travel became significantly safer across long stretches of Central Asia. Banditry was suppressed, relay stations were established, and diplomatic protection for merchants was institutionalized. One of the key innovations of the Mongol system was the Yam, a relay network of postal stations spread across the empire. These stations provided horses, food, lodging, and supplies for messengers and officials traveling across vast distances. This system dramatically reduced travel time and allowed for relatively rapid communication between distant regions of the empire. It also indirectly benefited merchants who traveled along similar routes. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road reached a level of integration it had never achieved before. Goods, people, technologies, and ideas moved more freely across Eurasia than at any earlier point in history. Chinese silk, Persian textiles, Indian spices, Arab scientific knowledge, and European goods circulated within a single imperial framework. China itself came under Mongol rule after the conquest of the Song dynasty, leading to the establishment of the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. Kublai Khan shifted the Mongol capital toward China and adopted aspects of Chinese administration, while still maintaining Mongol political structures. This fusion created a hybrid imperial system that linked East Asia directly into the broader Mongol world. At the same time, the Mongols conquered Persia, establishing the Ilkhanate and extended influence into Russia through the Golden Horde. These regional khanates were interconnected politically and economically, even though they operated with a degree of autonomy. Together, they formed a continental system that unified much of the Silk Road under shared imperial conditions. One of the most famous consequences of this integration was the increased movement of travelers across Eurasia. Perhaps the most well-known example is Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose journey to China during the late 13th century became one of the most influential travel accounts in world history. While some details of his writings are debated, his descriptions reflect a world in which long-distance travel across Eurasia, though still difficult, was far more feasible than in earlier centuries. Marco Polo described cities such as Khanbalik, modern Beijing, the administration of the Yuan court, and the wealth and complexity of Asian markets. His accounts helped introduce Europe to a more detailed understanding of Asia, even if filtered through interpretation and translation. But the Mongol era was not defined only by commerce and exploration. It was also a period of unprecedented biological exchange, with consequences that would reshape world history. One of the most significant and devastating examples of this was the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, likely originated in Central or East Asia and spread along trade routes through the Mongol Empire. As caravans, armies, and ships moved across interconnected regions, the disease traveled with them. By the mid-14th century, the plague had reached the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, where it caused catastrophic population loss. Entire cities were affected, economies collapsed, and social structures were deeply destabilized. The pandemic demonstrated a harsh reality of Silk Road connectivity. The same networks that enabled prosperity and cultural exchange also enabled rapid transmission of disease on a continental scale. Despite this tragedy, trade did not permanently cease. Instead, the Mongol Empire itself began to fragment during the 14th century due to internal conflict, succession disputes, and external pressures. The unified political structure that had supported the Pax Mongolica gradually dissolved into separate khanates. In China, the Yuan dynasty eventually fell to the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Ming rulers initially maintained some engagement with maritime trade, but they increasingly restricted long-distance overland exchange and later implemented maritime restrictions at various points. This shift contributed to a gradual reorientation of Chinese external trade policies. In the western regions, the Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed, while the Golden Horde in Russia fragmented over time. As Mongol political unity weakened, the Silk Road began to lose the centralized protection that had made it so efficient during the 13th century. However, it is important to understand that the Silk Road did not simply disappear after the Mongol period. Instead, it transformed once again. Trade routes persisted, but they became more regionalized and less unified under a single imperial system. Maritime trade, in particular, continued to grow in importance. The Indian Ocean network, already well established during earlier centuries, became increasingly dominant in global exchange. Muslim merchants, Chinese traders, and Southeast Asian kingdoms all participated in these oceanic systems, which were often more stable and commercially efficient than overland routes. Meanwhile, in Europe, the disruptions caused by the Black Death and the decline of Mongol connectivity contributed to major economic and social transformations. European powers began seeking more direct access to Asian goods, particularly spices, which eventually contributed to the age of exploration in the 15th century. In this sense, the Mongol era represents both the peak and a turning point of the Silk Road's history. It was the moment when Eurasia became most fully connected under a single overarching system, but also the moment when the vulnerabilities of that system became unmistakably clear. The Silk Road had reached its greatest geographical and cultural extent, but the world was already beginning to change. New maritime technologies, shifting political structures, and emerging global ambitions would soon redirect the flow of world trade away from traditional overland routes. A new era was approaching, one that would gradually replace the classical Silk Road with ocean-based global networks that connected not just Eurasia, but the entire world. After the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road did not vanish, but it lost the single unifying structure that had briefly held it together. What emerged instead was a more complex and less centralized world, where overland trade competed increasingly with expanding maritime networks. This transition marks the beginning of the early modern phase of Silk Road history, a period defined by shifting power centers, rising oceanic empires, and the gradual reorientation of global trade away from Central Asia. In China, the Ming dynasty, established in 1368 after the fall of the Yuan, initially sought to restore stability and Confucian governance after the Mongol period. The early Ming rulers were deeply suspicious of foreign influence, especially after the disruptions associated with Mongol rule and the devastation of the Black Death era. As a result, they gradually reduced official support for long-distance overland trade and implemented more controlled and restrictive trade policies. However, this was not a complete isolation. The Ming state still engaged in diplomacy and commerce, particularly through tributary systems that regulated foreign relations. Chinese goods, especially porcelain, silk, and tea, remained highly sought after across Asia and beyond. Yet the emphasis shifted away from the vast overland caravan networks of Central Asia and toward more controlled coastal and maritime exchanges. One of the most significant developments of the early Ming period was the series of maritime expeditions led by Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century. These voyages, conducted between 1405 and 1433, were among the most ambitious naval expeditions in history up to that time. Zheng He's fleets traveled across the Indian Ocean, reaching Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the eastern coast of Africa. These expeditions demonstrated China's maritime capability and its connection to the broader Indian Ocean world. They brought back tribute, exotic goods, and diplomatic envoys, reinforcing China's status as a major global power. However, after these voyages ended, the Ming court shifted focus inward, and large-scale maritime exploration was not continued at the same level. While China's engagement with long-distance trade became more selective, other regions of Eurasia became increasingly important in maintaining and reshaping Silk Road connectivity. In the Islamic world, new powerful states emerged that played central roles in both overland and maritime trade networks. The Ottoman Empire, expanding from the 14th century onward, came to control key sections of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. By capturing Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans effectively controlled one of the most important strategic points between Asia and Europe. This gave them significant influence over the flow of goods entering European markets from the east. At the same time, the Safavid Empire in Persia and the Mughal Empire in India created additional layers of political organization across the Silk Road's core regions. The Safavids controlled key overland routes through Iran, while also competing with the Ottomans over regional dominance. The Mughals, established in the early 16th century, integrated much of the Indian subcontinent into broader Eurasian trade systems, strengthening connections between South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Despite the decline of unified overland imperial control, these Islamic empires ensured that parts of the Silk Road remained active and highly productive. Persian carpets, Indian textiles, spices, and precious stones continued to circulate widely, while intellectual exchange in science, medicine, and philosophy remained vibrant across the Islamic world. However, the most transformative shift of this era was not the persistence of overland trade, but the rapid rise of maritime global networks. The Indian Ocean had long been a major corridor of exchange, but during the early modern period, it became the dominant artery of intercontinental trade. Muslim merchants had already established extensive maritime networks linking East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Cities such as Calicut, Malacca, Hormuz, and Aden became critical nodes in this oceanic system. Goods moved with the monsoon winds, creating a predictable seasonal rhythm that allowed for large-scale commercial integration. Into this already active system entered European maritime powers, beginning with Portugal in the late 15th century. Motivated by the desire to bypass overland intermediaries and gain direct access to Asian spices and luxury goods, European explorers sought sea routes to Asia. This marked a major turning point in global history. The voyage of Vasco da Gama in 1498, which successfully reached India by sailing around Africa, effectively opened a direct European maritime link to the Indian Ocean world. Unlike the earlier Silk Road system, which relied on multiple intermediaries across continents, European maritime expansion increasingly aimed at direct control over trade routes and sources of goods. This development did not immediately destroy existing Silk Road networks, but it began to reshape them. European powers, particularly Portugal and later the Netherlands and England, established fortified trading posts and naval dominance in key maritime choke points. This gradually shifted the balance of global trade away from traditional Asian-controlled networks toward European-controlled maritime systems. At the same time, overland Silk Road routes faced increasing challenges. The fragmentation of Central Asia into competing khanates and regional powers made long-distance caravan trade less secure than it had been under Mongol rule. While trade still continued, it was no longer the dominant global system it had once been. The Ottoman Empire still facilitated significant east-west exchange, particularly in luxury goods entering Europe. Cities such as Istanbul became major commercial hubs where goods from Asia, Africa, and Europe converged. However, European maritime expansion increasingly bypassed these traditional routes, reducing their centrality in global trade. Despite these shifts, it is important not to view the Silk Road as simply ending. Instead, it was being absorbed into a new global system. The same goods that once traveled overland, silk, spices, porcelain, textiles, precious metals, continued to circulate, but increasingly through oceanic routes rather than caravan networks. This transition also had profound cultural consequences. The age of exploration led to intensified global exchange on a scale previously unseen in human history. While the classical Silk Road had connected Eurasia, the early modern period began connecting the entire world, including the Americas, after 1492. The Columbian Exchange, which followed European contact with the Americas, added entirely new dimensions to global trade networks. Crops such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao spread across continents, while Old World animals, diseases, and technologies were introduced to the Americas. This marked the beginning of a truly global interconnected system that extended beyond the traditional Silk Road geography. In this New World system, the Silk Road did not disappear so much as dissolve into broader global networks. Its overland routes remained important for regional trade and cultural exchange, but the center of gravity in world commerce had shifted decisively toward maritime empires and global sea routes. By the end of the early modern period, the Silk Road had transitioned from a dominant Eurasian network into a historical foundation for global connectivity. Its legacy persisted not as a single route, but as a system of interaction that had shaped civilizations for nearly 2 millennia. And even as new global powers emerged, The patterns established by the Silk Road, exchange across distance, cultural blending, and economic interdependence, remained fundamental to how the world continued to develop. By the time the early modern maritime empires had redrawn the map of global trade, the Silk Road, as a dominant, unified system of exchange, had already dissolved. But it did not end in any clean or final sense. Instead, it entered a long period of transformation, where its old overland routes persisted in reduced but still meaningful forms, while its historical legacy began to shape how people understood global connectivity itself. In the 17th to 19th centuries, overland Silk Road routes through Central Asia continued to function, but under very different conditions than before. The major imperial structures that had once stabilized Eurasian trade, the Mongols, the Tang, the Abbasids, were gone. In their place stood regional khanates, steppe confederations, and expanding empires such as Qing China and Tsarist Russia, each gradually extending control into Central Asia. Qing dynasty, which ruled China from the mid-17th century, reasserted control over Xinjiang and parts of Central Asia during the 18th century. This expansion temporarily revitalized some overland trade routes as the Qing integrated Inner Asia into its imperial system. Caravan trade continued, linking China with Central Asian markets, Persia, and beyond. However, this trade was increasingly secondary to maritime commerce, which dominated global economics by this point. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire expanded steadily across Siberia and into Central Asia. Russian control over steppe and desert regions introduced new administrative systems, military structures, and trade regulations. Central Asia became a contested frontier zone between Russian and Qing influence, gradually reshaping the old Silk Road corridors into imperial borderlands rather than open transcontinental highways. Despite these political changes, traditional caravan cities such as Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar continued to function as regional trading centers. They were no longer the central hubs of a unified Eurasian system, but they still connected local economies and preserved older cultural traditions. Islamic scholarship, Persian literature, and Central Asian merchant culture remained active in these regions, maintaining continuity with earlier Silk Road traditions. However, by the 19th century, the rise of industrialization in Europe fundamentally altered global trade dynamics. Steamships, railways, and modern communication systems dramatically reduced the importance of long, slow overland trade routes. Goods could now be transporting faster, cheaper, and in larger quantities through industrial maritime and rail networks than through traditional caravan systems. European imperial expansion into Asia further reshaped the remnants of Silk Road geography. British control over India, Russian expansion into Central Asia, and French presence in Southeast Asia integrated much of the old Silk Road world into competing colonial systems. These empires did not revive the Silk Road. Instead, they absorbed its regions into global colonial economies structured around raw material extraction and industrial manufacturing. By this stage, the Silk Road had become more of a historical concept than an active system, yet its influence remained deeply embedded in global consciousness. Archaeological exploration in the 19th and early 20th centuries began to uncover lost cities, manuscripts, and artifacts along Central Asian routes. Explorers and scholars from Europe and Asia rediscovered oasis cities buried under desert sands, including sites along the Taklamakan Desert, revealing the richness of past Silk Road civilizations. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries came from the Mogao Caves near Dunhuang in China. This vast complex of Buddhist cave temples contained thousands of manuscripts, paintings, and artifacts dating back over 1,000 years. The Dunhuang manuscripts revealed the extraordinary cultural diversity of Silk Road societies, including texts in Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, Sogdian, and other languages. They provided direct evidence of the Silk Road's role as a multicultural intellectual network, not just a trade route. In the 20th century, historical scholarship began to redefine the Silk Road not as a single fixed highway, but as a concept describing intercontinental exchange systems. The term itself, Silk Road, was coined in the 19th century by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen. Modern historians expanded this idea, emphasizing that the Silk Road was never one road, but a dynamic network of routes connecting diverse civilizations over time. This academic reinterpretation shifted understanding from a romanticized trade route to a more complex system of economic, cultural, and technological exchange. The Silk Road came to be seen as one of the earliest examples of globalization, demonstrating how interconnected human societies had been long before the modern era. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, interest in the Silk Road experienced a major revival, both in academic research and in global politics. New archaeological discoveries, satellite imaging, and interdisciplinary historical studies continued to uncover the scale and complexity of ancient Eurasian connectivity. At the same time, modern infrastructure projects began to echo the idea of Silk Road connectivity in new forms. One of the most significant of these is China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in the 21st century. This global infrastructure strategy aims to build transportation, energy, and trade networks connecting Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. It explicitly references the historical Silk Road as inspiration, though it operates in a completely different technological and political context. The Belt and Road Initiative includes the development of railways, highways, ports, and digital infrastructure across multiple continents. It represents a modern reinterpretation of the ancient principle of interconnected trade corridors, but on a scale made possible by industrial and digital technology. While it is not a continuation of the Silk Road in a literal historical sense, it reflects the enduring appeal of the idea of Eurasian connectivity. Beyond modern politics, the Silk Road continues to shape cultural identity and global imagination. It is often used as a symbol of peaceful exchange, cultural blending, and historical globalization. Museums, documentaries, academic programs, and cultural projects across the world continue to explore its legacy. Yet it is important to understand the Silk Road not only as a story of harmony and exchange, but also as a complex system shaped by empire, inequality, competition, and vulnerability. It enabled extraordinary cultural and technological diffusion, but it also transmitted disease, facilitated imperial expansion, and depended heavily on political control and economic imbalance. Its legacy is therefore not simple. It is neither purely idealized nor purely exploitative. It is a reflection of how human societies have always interacted across distance, balancing cooperation and conflict, opportunity and risk. From its earliest beginnings in fragmented prehistoric exchange networks, through its classical development under Han China and Rome, its transformation under Islamic and Mongol empires, its restructuring in the early modern maritime world, and its reinterpretation in the modern era, the Silk Road represents one of the longest and most complex stories of human connection in history. It was never just a route for silk. It was a living system of exchange that connected civilizations across continents for nearly 2,000 years, shaping the development of languages, religions, technologies, economies, and cultures in ways that still define the modern world today. And even now, its influence continues to travel, not along camel caravans or ancient desert roads, but through global trade, digital communication, and the ongoing interconnectedness of human society. Like and subscribe and comment what topic you would like to see covered in the next video.